Okay, so today's topic is about macroeconomics, and from this topic onwards we actually move from the microeconomics section of the unit to macroeconomics. We used to discuss the firm's behavior, the consumer's behavior, the market's behavior in microeconomics, whereas from now onwards we are going to discuss how the economies work as a whole. So from now onwards I'm not going to talk about the price of a product. Instead I'll be talking about the price levels in the economy. That means I'll be talking about inflation in the economy. I would not be talking about the demand and supply. In fact, I'll be talking about the aggregate demand in the economy and aggregate supply in the economy. So we move to the macroeconomics part, and I hope you all will enjoy this part of the unit. So what are the learning objectives of today's topic is basically the learning objectives are: number one, you need to understand what is macroeconomics. You need to understand how the macroeconomic aggregates. There are three macroeconomic aggregates: real GDP, unemployment, and inflation. So we need to understand how these three macroeconomic aggregates represent the growth of an economy. And finally, what are the business cycles and what happens to the macroeconomic aggregates in case of different phases of the business cycle. So, for example, if I tell you that in the long run the Australian economy has experienced economic growth, and almost for most of the people the living standards have been risen. But if you talk about the over the time period economic growth, you'll see that the Australian economy has faced periodic fluctuations that every economy faces basically. Now these periodic fluctuations are nothing but the business cycles or the phases of the business cycles. So though overall the economy is growing, but if you consider the short-run fluctuations, you'll actually understand that there are many ups and downs in the economy in the short run, and those ups and downs are basically the phases of the business cycle. And we also need to understand that GDP, unemployment, and inflation, these are the three macroeconomic aggregates that basically economists can use to analyze the performance of an economy. So if the GDP, what is GDP? GDP is the national income of an economy, the income of all the people in an economy. So if the income of all the people is increasing, definitely we can say that the economy is growing. Unemployment, if the unemployment rate is low, we can say that the economy is in a good position. Inflation, so if the inflation rate is stable, then we'll say the economy is stable and the performance of the economy is good. So before I cover those macroeconomic aggregates, just to remind you of the basic difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Now microeconomics is basically the study of individuals like households and firms. So in microeconomics we study consumer behavior, producer behavior, we study the markets, and we study the consumer choices and so on. Whereas in the macroeconomics we study the economy as a whole. That means we study the inflation, we study unemployment, we study the real GDP, and we study the economic growth of the economy. And basically macroeconomics is nothing but the study of national aggregates of an economy. And just to give you an idea on how the national aggregates look like, this is just a suggestion that you go to ABS website, Australian Bureau of Statistics website, and you just click on the key national indicators, and you'll find that this survey talks about the national indicators of Australian economy. So GDP, I'll be discussing the first macroeconomic indicator that represents the performance or growth of an economy. So basically economists, they can measure the total production and growth in an economy by its GDP. There's a positive relation. If the GDP is at a high level, we would say that the economy is expanding and the growth is there. And specifically saying economic growth, we always measure the economic growth by the rate of growth in real GDP per capita. So GDP is just one part, but basically the instrument that we can use, the better instrument that we can use is growth in real GDP per capita. So there are three words that I'll let you explain in a short while. So before that, let's try to understand the word GDP. So GDP is basically the gross domestic product, and this is the market value of all the final goods and services produced in an economy during a given period of time. So there are 4 sections of the definition. Number 1, the first requirement of GDP is that we talk about the market value and we don't talk about anything else. So we talk about the market value. That means the value of the product in the market. That means by selling the product, how much we can earn basically. Of all the final goods and services. So the final is important here. So we're talking about the final goods and services that are ready to use, and we don't talk about the intermediate commodities, like we don't talk about if I'm selling tires to a company that uses tires for the car manufacturing. So tires manufacturing won't be counted in the GDP, whereas the car as a whole, that includes the tires as well, would be counted. So car is a final good, but the tires are not the final goods and services. And they are produced in an economy during a given period of time, so they should be produced within the economy, and we'll be talking about a period of time and generally saying this is 1 year. GDP and economic growth. So GDP uses market value, it uses only final goods and services, and it only talks about current production, and it doesn't talk about the value of second-hand goods, because if I sell you a car, and if I sell you a car in 2014, so that car is not being produced as a new commodity. That has already been produced 5 years back, and now I'm just reselling it. So the commodities with second-hand sale won't get counted in the GDP. Okay, so this is just a mathematical example of how we calculate GDP. So assume that we are talking about a very simple economy where only 3 products are being produced: TVs, pizzas, and lettuce. So how do you calculate the GDP for this kind of economy? So what you need to do is quantity of a good produced into the price per unit that has been produced in the economy. So 50 into 1000 would be the market value of TVs, 500 into 10 would be the market value for all the pizzas, and 1000 into 4 would be the market value for this product here. So you calculate the market value and you add up all the market values of all the final goods and services being produced, and we call it as total GDP, which is equal to $59,000 in this particular example. Now, how do we measure GDP? So Australian Bureau of Statistics uses 3 different measures to measure GDP, and those 3 measures are production method, expenditure method, and income method. Okay, production method is basically the sum of the value of all the final goods and services produced in an economy. So basically we look at the production that has taken place in an economy during a period of time, say 1 year. Expenditure method is where we consider the money being spent or the expenditure made on final goods and services by households, investors, government, and net exports. So when we count the expenditure made by all the people in the economy, including households, investors, government, and net exporters, then we are basically talking about the expenditure method. And the third is income method. That means the sum of the income generated from the production of goods and services, and it includes profits, wages, and other employee payments, income from rent, and interest earned. So basically income of all the factors of production in an economy, income of all the factors of production, and if you add up those incomes you get the GDP by using the income method. This is really important because this slide talks about the components of GDP, and there are 4 different components of GDP. Those are consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. So C, I, G, and NX. What is consumption? Basically consumption is spending by the households on maybe non-durable goods or durable goods, or consumption of health, education, holidays, packages. So basically consumption by the households, and it doesn't include spending on new houses, and because that gets included in investment. And generally speaking, out of C, I, G, and NX, C is basically the largest component of GDP. It would be around 50 to 60% if we talk about Australian economy. Investment, so this basically includes 3 categories. Business fixed investment, so this would be spending by the firms on new factories, office buildings, machinery, and computers. And then we include the inventories, the products being produced but not being sold yet. And then we talk about the residential investment spending by households on new housing. G is the third component, and G includes government consumption and government investment. So G includes two components of the government expenditure. One is the government spending, and government spending is basically the spending of government on pure consumption goods, and we talk about government investment spending. That means when government invests some money on infrastructure or on other investment projects. And you have to note down here that we don't include the spending on transfer payments in G because they are just the transfer payments. They are not any new productions or any new transactions. They're basically transferring hands. So net exports is net export basically refer to the value of exports minus expenditure on imports. So by selling the exports, whatever you get minus when you buy products from offshore, so how much you pay them. So exports minus imports will be net exports. Just an example of the GDP components 2010 and 11 in Australia. So consumption component is generally the highest one, and then comes the G, and then comes the I, and then comes the net exports. We do have a smaller share of net exports in Australia because we don't export much here. And our basic income, our GDP is basically dependent on C, I, and G, more or less, as compared to NX. Another chart where we talk about consumption, investment, government, and net exports in percentage terms. Now, does GDP measure what we want it to measure? Now, GDP is basically, I told you GDP is used as a proxy for the performance of an economy, for the economic growth of an economy. So it's being used as a proxy, and it's not a perfect measure of the economic growth. And what are the reasons for that? The reasons are, for example, when we calculate GDP, we don't include the household production. For example, we don't include the home cooking, we don't include the cleaning. So if I do some cooking at my home, that won't be counted in GDP, whereas if I go and work in a restaurant and I cook for that restaurant, I get income out of it, and then it would be counted in the GDP. So anything that we do for ourselves or for our children or for our families for which we don't get anything, they are not counted in the household production. They are not counted in the GDP. The black market is another problem that leads to GDP doing underestimation of the level of production, because whatever happens in the black market, we cannot measure that, and hence we don't include that in the GDP. So GDP does not include household production and the black market production. If I ask you, can money buy happiness? That is equivalent to when we say GDP is a measure of well-being of the people. So maybe we can discuss this in the workshop. So I told you GDP is not a perfect measure of the well-being of the people. Why it's not a perfect measure? Because it doesn't include household production, it doesn't consider the black market production. So we need to be aware of the shortcomings of GDP. For example, the distribution of GDP is not captured in GDP measures. This is a further shortcoming of GDP, that it doesn't matter who is getting how much from the total share of GDP. So who gets how much, or some gets well off, some get worse off. That distribution of income is basically not counted in the GDP. And the value of non-market production, again, this is the same as I already told you. Home production, that doesn't get counted in the GDP. GDP doesn't talk about the access to healthcare and education in a country. So though the GDP is increasing, but maybe the healthcare system of that economy is not good enough, or we don't get access to that healthcare or education system. So it doesn't talk about the quality or access to the basic facilities of people. It's not adjusted for externalities or negative effects of production. It's not at all adjusted for the changes in crime and other social problems. So because it doesn't cover these few points, so it may overestimate the well-being of the people. Another term is nominal GDP versus real GDP. So nominal GDP is basically when we're talking about the money value of the GDP. That means the market value of final goods and services, and that value gets evaluated at the current year prices. A real GDP, on the other hand, is where we take away the effect of inflation from the definition of GDP. So we take 1 year as the base year and we assume that the prices have not changed. So basically we take away the effect of inflation by taking one same base year, and then we see whether the GDP has increased or not in real terms. Because nominal GDP can change over time due to changes in price and output. For example, if the prices increase, that means the total market value of the same level of goods and services increases. That means, as a rule, the GDP would increase, but that is not a real increase in GDP, whereas real GDP only shows changes in the output and not the prices. So we take away the effect of increasing prices from in GDP, and this is also known as deflator, GDP deflator. When we take away the impact of the inflation from the GDP and we talk about the real increase in the output or production level in the economy. Calculating real GDP, for example, we have 2 years, 2009 and 2010. So the nominal GDP in 2009 is 59,000, whereas the nominal GDP in 2010 is 62,735. So if I ask you to calculate the real GDP in 2010, all you need to do is this quantity, but you will take the prices for 2009 as the base year, and you'll calculate these quantities with these prices and not these prices. So basically, you can calculate the real GDP by assuming 1 year. For example, here we are talking about 2009 as the base year. So you calculate, you multiply this quantity with the prices in the last year or in the base year, and then add them up. So nominal GDP, if you look at the nominal GDP, the growth rate in nominal GDP is basically this minus this divided by this into 100. So GDP has basically increased by 6.3%, and let's see what's going on with the real GDP. So we multiply the quantities of 2010 with the base year prices and we get 61,200. So that means though the nominal GDP has increased by 6.3%, which is also known as the growth rate of the economy, the real GDP has only grown by 3.7%. That means though it looks like that GDP has increased by 6.3%, but that is only a nominal GDP, and a major part of this change is because the prices have increased, and if you take away the effect of those price increases, you will only find out that the real GDP has grown by 3.7%, almost half of that. So we talk about the real GDP to better represent the economic growth of an economy. So growth rate, this is another calculation where you understand how to calculate the growth rate. So the growth rate would be year 2's figure minus year 1 divided by year 1 into 100. So you can calculate the growth rate for GDP, for prices, for anything, and the formula would remain the same. Okay. Long-run economic growth and living standards. So basically, real GDP is better than nominal GDP, and from real GDP there is one term that is even better, and that term is real GDP per capita. So what is real GDP per capita? This is equal to the real GDP in an economy divided by the number of people living in that economy. So real GDP per capita is basically the real income per head in an economy. So per person, how much we get, that would be the real GDP per capita, and this is even better than using the real GDP as such. This is just a figure of real GDP per capita. So we can safely say that the real GDP per capita income is increasing, which means standard of living of individuals in Australia has increased over this time period. Okay, so that was about GDP, and next we talk about the unemployment and inflation. Firstly, I'll be talking about unemployment, and before that we need to understand some labor force concepts. So labor force is basically, what is labor force? Labor force is the total number of employed and unemployed workers in an economy. So if there are 1,000 people in the economy, 500 are employed, 500 unemployed. So labor force would be employed plus unemployed, but in a age range that are eligible to work. So I'll explain you that in a short while. Unemployment refers to those people who are willing to work and have made an effort to find work but don't have jobs. So unemployed is a person who is willing to work and who has been looking for a work but cannot find work. So participation rate, another term, it is a proportion of people in the working age population that are in the labor force. So working age population would be from say 15 until 60, 65, 70, based on what country we are talking about. Discouraged workers are those workers who want to work but who believe that there is no job available, so they just surrender and they don't look for job anymore. Measuring unemployment. So how do we measure unemployment in an economy? For example, let's talk about Australia, how we measure the unemployment rate in Australia. So ABS, what does it say? The ABS, it does a survey which is known as the labor force survey, where a monthly sample of less than 0.5% of the population aged 15 and over is counted. Okay, to be classified as employed, a person must have worked only 1 hour or more in the week before the survey. So if I interview you and I ask you whether you have worked at least 1 hour paid work last week, and if you say yes to that, I would say you are employed and you are not unemployed. And to be classified as unemployed, a person must not have worked at all. So if you say, no, I didn't work in the last 1 week, so that is first qualification to become an unemployed. My second question would be, have you been actively looking for work? And if you say yes, then that would be the second qualification to be considered as unemployed. And my third and final question to decide whether you are unemployed or not would be, I'll ask you, are you ready to start work immediately? And if you say yes, then I would consider you as an unemployed. So for an unemployed person, there are 3 requirements. One, that this person has not worked at least not even 1 hour in the last 1 week. This person has been actively looking for a job, and this person is actually ready to start work immediately. So unemployment rate, what is unemployment rate in an economy? It's the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force into 100. So if there are 1,000 people and 500 are unemployed, so we'll do 500 divided by 1,000 into 100, and that will give us the unemployment rate. Labor force participation rate, so this would be the labor force, that means the total employed and unemployed population divided by the working age population into 100. Problems with measuring the unemployment rate. There are certain problems. I'll give you a few examples. For example, in recession, so people know that there is a recession and they become quite confident there are no jobs, and so they stop looking for jobs and they become the discouraged workers. So we don't count them as unemployed because they have not been looking out for jobs, but basically they are unemployed. We can't deny that, but we don't consider them officially as unemployed. Another problem is with the underemployed workers, people who are working part-time but who want to work full-time. We don't consider them as unemployed, we just consider them as employed. People who claim to be unemployed but are not. For example, I'm claiming some unemployment benefits, and if some government organization and some government representative asks me whether you have been looking for a job, I would say yes, because if I would say no, that means they'll stop giving me the unemployment benefit. So I would say no, I have been actively looking for a job, whereas the fact could be that I'm not actively looking for a job. So these are the problems with the measurement of the unemployment. Now, is unemployment bad? We would say yes. So there are different costs of unemployment in an economy, cost to the economy and cost to the individuals. So cost to the economy is if say 5% of the population is not working, that means we have less GDP because those 5% could contribute more. It's a loss of human capital because people are not working, but they have a capacity and they have skills that can help improving the economy. Retraining cost. If I become unemployed for 2 years and if I get back to work after 2 years, I basically need a training again. So that is a cost to the economy. When people join work after 5 years, 4 years, 6 months, or after a time period, then we need to retrain those people and we need to spend money on those people. And unemployment benefits are basically a net drain on the federal budget and they are burden on the economy. Loss of tax revenue. If 5% of the population is not working, that means we have less tax revenue from those 5% people. And there is an opportunity cost because the funds that government has to use for unemployment benefits could have been used for some other purposes. Cost of the unemployment to the people, definitely it's a loss of individual income, lower skills. If I'm not working, I'm not able to find job, I'll have less skills, I'll lack confidence, and there would be loss of self-esteem. It can also contribute to family breakups, health problems, and mental illness like depression. It can also lead to crime. It can also lead to political unrest. For example, Spain and Greece, this happened there. So individuals suffer if they are unemployed. Now, types of unemployment. Frictional unemployment is first type of unemployment, and basically frictional unemployment is people have different skill sets and the jobs may require different skill sets. So there's a mismatch between people looking for jobs and the jobs available. So for example, I'm looking for an academic job, but I can't find academic job, but in the market there is a job for, say, a technician. So there's a mismatch between the skills that are required for a job and the skills that people possess. And this leads to frictional unemployment. School leavers, for example, they're looking for jobs. The graduates looking for their first jobs. People re-entering the workforce after an absence. People who have lost or quit their jobs and are looking for new jobs. For example, if you're not happy working at some of the, say, food joints and you quit that job because you believe that you deserve far more than or far better than that, so you quit one job in search of another job, that means you are frictionally unemployed. Seasonal unemployment due to factors such as seasonal productions or tourism. So holiday seasons, for example, some of the economies they earn high income levels in tourist seasons, and likewise there could be seasonal production. For example, ice cream vendors, or for example the ski people in the people doing ski in those hilly areas. So basically, seasonal productions are the productions that are only done at a certain time period of a year, and rest of the time period they just became unemployed. Structural unemployment, unemployment arising from a persistent mismatch between the skill and characteristics of workers and requirements of job. So basically this is because of the structure of the economy. So the structure of the economy demands one thing, and the skill set that the people possess, it's another thing. So new technology, for example. So for example, the economy gets developed, and now whatever we do it on computers. And if I don't possess those computerized skills, I become unemployed because I'm not fit with that new structure of the economy. Healthy low-fat food, for example, people start preferring the healthy foods. That means if I'm producing the junk food and people don't prefer it anymore to have it, then my job is in danger. Cyclical unemployment, this is basically that happens in business cycles and happens in the low part of the business cycle. That means in the recession, demand deficient unemployment is another name. And basically falling sales due to this lead to cutbacks on production and sacking of the workers. What is full employment? Okay, I ask you a question, can unemployment be zero? So the answer would be no, unemployment can never be zero. There would always be a certain percentage of the population that will always remain unemployment, and the reason being that full employment occurs even when there is no cyclical unemployment. The reason being there is a concept that is known as natural rate of unemployment. That means this is natural to any economy. This would naturally happen. So the normal rate of unemployment consisting of structural plus frictional unemployment. So at the full employment level, even there at that point, there would be some structural and some frictional unemployment level. And this concept also known as non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. That means that level of inflation that will not lead to any, that level of unemployment that will not lead to any increase in the rate of inflation. So third term, inflation. We discussed GDP, we discussed unemployment, and this is the third term that we need to understand. So what is inflation? Before that, we need to understand what is price level. So a measure of the general level of prices of goods and services in an economy is price level, and inflation is basically a sustained increase in the general level of prices in an economy. So a continuous increase in prices is inflation. And mind it, it's a continued increase in the general price level in an economy. So if prices increase all of a sudden and they increase just for a short time period, we don't call it as inflation, because inflation is a persistent rise in prices. What is the rate of inflation? The percentage increase in the general price level in an economy from one year to the next. Basically, the growth rates of the prices can be used to measure the inflation rate in the economy. This is the same thing that I already discussed. The only new point here is inflation is measured by the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and this Consumer Price Index measures the changes in the average prices of consumer goods and services. What is this CPI? Basically, we consider a basket of goods and services, and when the prices for those goods and services increase, we say that the inflation is increasing by a certain percentage. So it's basically an average of the prices of goods and services purchased by a typical urban family of four. For example, ABS surveys households on their spending habits. So the goods and services typically purchased by the household, we call it as a market basket, and there are about 25,000 items in that basket. So the prices of goods and services in the market basket are given a weight according to their fraction of a typical family budget. So we generalize that the prices have increased by a percentage, which would be equal to the percentage of increase in prices for this market basket. Another example of CPI in Australia. So this is 2011. So food and alcoholic beverages, non-alcoholic beverages 16.84, alcohol and tobacco 7%, clothing we spent 3.98%, housing we spent 22% of the budgets, furnishing we spent 9%, and so on. So basically this is a market basket of commodities, and whatever price changes would be happening in these cases, we'll generalize those price changes for the rest of the products as well. Headline and underlying inflation. So CPI basically is the headline rate, and the underlying rate is when we remove the effects of extreme price changes. For example, if there would be a flood in Queensland and there would be a sudden increase in banana prices, so that's just an extreme price change, and we try to avoid that to calculate the underlying rate of inflation. Is inflation bad for the economy? Again, before you answer that, there's another question: can we decrease inflation to 0%? The answer would be again no. There is certain percentage of inflation or certain rate of inflation which is good for the economy and which should always be good. It could be 3%, 4%, 5%, 6% based on what economy we are talking about. So does inflation imposes a cost on the economy? Yes, it imposes a cost because it affects the distribution of income. So if prices are increasing by 5%, assume, and at the same time our income levels are also increasing by 5%, then it does not impose any extra cost on us. But there would be different people whose income levels would be increasing by different amounts. So for example, the inflation increased by 5%. My income increases by 10%, your income increases by 2%. So I'll be the winner, you'll be the loser. So it affects the distribution of income. Who holds how much? That would be a problem. And also there are two types of inflation, and it depends on what inflation we are talking about. Anticipated inflation is where we can actually forecast, okay, next year 5% would be the inflation rate, and we add on the prices, or we frame the prices, or we adjust the rents based on that anticipated inflation. And unanticipated is if something happens all of a sudden and we did not expect those prices to rise by 5%, but the prices actually increased without our expectation. So that is bad. Anticipated inflation can be managed, whereas unanticipated inflation cannot be measured. I told you with unanticipated we have winners and losers, and with anticipated we can still manage it. So does inflation impose cost on the economy? Yes, because it redistributes income in arbitrary ways. It diverts resources from productive to inflation forecasting, because we need resources to forecast the inflation. It increases uncertainty and it decreases our international competitiveness. For example, if the prices increase in Australia, our products become less competitive in the world market. And it is costly to eliminate inflation from the economy. Causes of inflation, there are two causes: demand pull and cost push. So demand pull inflation is when prices increase because of the demand side. So when the demand increases far more than supply, aggregate demand I'm talking about here, so prices are pulled up by the pressure from the buyers. And so demand pull inflation is when the prices increase because the aggregate demand in the economy increases, and it increases far more than the increase in the supply. Cost push inflation, it is from the supply side, and it is a rise in the general price level resulting from an increase in the cost of production irrespective of demand conditions. If there would be an oil price shock, or construction cost increases, or interest rates increase, so the cost of production would increase and it will lead to high prices, and it would be called as cost push inflation. Okay, so a natural disaster such as a severe drought can cause cost inflation. You agree with that? If you agree, then think of the reasons, or think of any example that can actually explain this kind of inflation. Business cycles. So what are the business cycles? They are the fluctuations in aggregate economic activity. Now what is aggregate economic activity? GDP, unemployment, inflation. These are the main representatives. So it is basically it considers the fluctuations in the aggregate economic activity in which many economic activities expand and contract together in a recurring but not a periodic fashion. So that means they happen again and again, but we can't predict them because they are not in a they are not in a periodic fashion. They are random. There are four phases of business cycle: trough, expansion, peak, and contraction. So basically two phases and two turning points: contraction and expansion. Contraction we can also call it as recession, and expansion we can call it as recovery or boom, and recovery basically. And two turning points are peak and trough. So contraction is a downswing, and contraction happens when there is a significant decrease in aggregate economic activity or a slowdown in the growth rate of economy. So it begins just after the economy reaches a peak. So that means if the economy touches the peak, if the economy touches a boom, then the next cycle we would expect, the next phase we would expect in a business cycle would be the slowing down of those activities, and hence it leads to contraction. And between trough and peak, the economy is in an expansion, and I told you before as well, a contraction is a fall in economic activities, but a severe contraction can be termed as a recession. So this is a trend line. I'm taking economic activity here and time here. So over the time period we are looking at economic activities. So this is a trend line. That means normally or generally saying the economy should grow at this rate. Okay, so this is a trend line, expected line. But what happens, sometimes economy performs better than this, sometimes economy performs worse than this. So this phase where the economic activities are declining is contraction. This phase is expansion, contraction again, expansion again. This is peak, and this point is trough, and this is also known as depression. This is peak and also known as boom. This phase can also be termed as recovery, recovery from a recession. So real GDP, these are the features. Real GDP rises during expansion and contracts during recession, and unemployment falls during expansion and rises during recessions. This is a business cycle based on US economy. So this was the GFC, Global Financial Crisis, and this was how it looked like. This is a typical Australian business cycle, happened in 1990s and it was until December 91. So there was a peak, and then there was a downturn, contraction, trough, and then an expansion, downturn again, and then expansion again. So what happens during a business cycle? Each business cycle is different, however all share some similarities. Like the end of the expansion is always associated with, or most often associated with, rising interest rates, rising wages, and profits begins to fall. Recession of it starts with decreased spending by firms. When firms they don't spend money. Basically, when people don't spend money, this is a feature of a recession. What happens to unemployment? Unemployment rises in the contraction phase, and unemployment falls in the expansion phase. And so that was it. And I hope you read this lecture material, and we'll discuss a few more examples, and we'll discuss the applications of this topic next week in the workshop, next week in the workshop. So I'll see you in the next workshop. Thank you.